When you come out of that school, you're going to be a leader. You're not going to be a leader because after you spend a year in that school, you begin to forget what the outside is like.
He was charged with 1 count of buggery and 1 count of indecent assault male. These charges were laid as a result of an investigation into the sexual assault of a male student of Upper Canada College back in 1971.
As soon as I received his letter, I phoned to see how he was, and I mean, this has been a long time, 25 years ago.
It's not a repressed memory or anything unusual like that. It has bothered him for his entire life, and he's come to the point where he felt that he had strength to report it.
Those clips were about a case of sexual abuse at Canada's most famous private school, Upper Canada College. My next guest has both attended and written about that institution. James FitzGerald calls it an ongoing abuse of privilege. His book, Old Boys, The Powerful Legacy of Upper Canada College. Would you send your kids to boarding school? Call 1-800-665-1433 to contribute. James FitzGerald joins me from Toronto. That case about a master from Upper Canada College, we have heard and we know that there have been cases of sexual abuse in the public school system. What's the, I guess, significance of it happening in the private school system, James?
Well, I think this case is instructive because it's really disturbing because Mr. Noble was charged 1.5 years ago, and the Canadian press attempted to interview me about this case recently. And long story short, there's still no public record of this case.
What do you mean, no public record? I mean, we
the
just
actual details of the case are not a matter of public record, and this is where I get back to the school in a minute, but a Canadian press reporter called me and interviewed me and interviewed the Crown and the victim and so on, and called Upper Canada for a comment. Upper Canada was very aggressive with them, with the reporter, and the end result was that the story was killed, and this is a national news organization. So this is.
So what are you saying there? What's the implication there?
Well, the implication is, I asked the reporter, I said, why was this story not published? And she said they were afraid of being sued. And I said, how could you be sued for
he was convicted,
reporting the details of a conviction, that he's pleading guilty, that he did this? And so the implications of this were really alarming to me because it's like...
But say it out loud. What are you talking about, the power of the UCC Old Boys?
Or their perceived threat. I mean, I was talking about moral failures of the elites. I mean, I think the media is involved in this too. I think that the media, for some reason, I'm just struck by the fact that there's been sexual abuse stories all over the media for the last 5-10 years. We're hearing more and more about it. We're hearing about Maple Leaf Gardens, and we're hearing about Mount Cashel and choir schools in Kingston, and we know that it exists in the upper echelons of society too. And yet it hasn't been sort of investigated or dealt with as far as I can see.
So is that what you mean when you talk about private schools? The phrase you used in your introduction was the abuse of privilege in private schools?
Yes, and I think there's the fundamental contradiction is, I think, that there, in my 10 years at the school, and my father before me, and that we were inculcated with moral principles, and this is one of the great strengths of these schools. And when I did my book, I was really impressed with very decent, moral people, and progressive and humane and bright, and who wanted to confront these things. The leadership of the school, unfortunately, is not setting an example. And I think that was one of the original mandates of these schools, that like the churches or religious institutions, or they have a special obligation to step forward when these things happen and deal with it creatively and proactively. And it's what we're getting, unfortunately, as we do in a lot of these other institutions, is just a distancing. This happened 25 years ago. It doesn't affect us. Go away. We don't want to talk about this. And I don't think that's good enough. And I'm not saying we should have a witch hunt, and I'm not saying everybody has to become a therapist, or but it's incumbent on these people to do it, because there are so many people in that community who actually can and want to. So there's this amazing kind of frustration.
Let's bring some other people into this continuing conversation about boarding schools. You've brought in a whole other aspect of the, I suppose, the contradictions of an elite school, the implicit contradictions of an elite school. Kathleen O'Brien is from Edmonton. We posed the question, would you send your kids to boarding school? Kathleen, how would you answer that?
Yes, I would. I have had my son in a public school system for 6 years. He has done very lousy. I'd like to make the point that 90% of the teachers in the school system now are female. There's not enough supervision out in the school grounds. There's not enough supervision in the hallways.
So a private school, this is a boys' private school you sent him
Yes.
to. So for you, the great advantage is he's put, what, in a male environment?
He's put in a male environment. There's consistency. There's routine. My child has totally changed since he's gone in there 5 months ago. He went in grade 7.
Okay, James, comment on that, because of course that's one of the great features of boarding schools, that they're all male, that there is some kind of, you know, discipline in them. What's the dark side of that? Or is there a dark side of that?
Well, I should also say, I'm talking about private schools too. I mean, there are co-ed private schools, they're all male schools, they're all girls' schools. I mean, we have choices.
Right.
I'm not saying these places are intrinsically abusive. I'm saying that it's incumbent on the people that run them to be aware of these things, and I think there's been an abdication of this in the past. I mean, I think it's an old cliche. I mean, it's an overused term, but in denial. I mean, at Upper Canada, certainly, I focus on Upper Canada because I went there, but it is the flagship school in the independent school system.
But you have a lot of stories. You have a lot of stories in your book, and I don't know if they predominate, but a lot of stories about the boys that go into this male environment and they come out not being able to cope in a co-ed world in some senses.
Very true, absolutely. And that's an aside issue in a sense, but I think the fact that Upper Canada has not gone co-ed and fiercely resisted it for a long time is highly problematic. When they call themselves, the chairman of the board and the principal interviewed them said, this is the best school in Canada. They made that claim. So how can the best school in Canada by definition not be co-ed? I mean,
So that means
there's a whole debate there that isn't happening.
Girls don't get to become among the best, don't get to go to the best school in Canada.
By definition. And there's no internal debate at Upper Canada about this. They suppress these kinds of issues. They will not have conversations about this. They refuse to come on tonight when you invited them on. I mean, this is really problematic.
Sarah Harrison is in Ottawa. Sarah Harrison, would you send your kids to private school?
Well, I most certainly wouldn't send my children to boarding school. I myself went to study at boarding school in England, and there was drug and alcohol abuse among a large majority of the students. And in fact, one of the members of staff was supplying the students with the narcotics. And when I approached a member of staff to inform them of the ongoings, I was basically turned against, and I eventually was driven away. I had to leave within 2-3 months.
But there's drug and alcohol abuse in high school, you know, in a public high school.
Well, this wasn't in a public high school. This
No, but what I mean is, what makes a boarding school worse? I mean, that's what parents are worried about in public high schools. I guess it's that you're suggesting that it's supplied by in the instance you saw, supplied by the teachers?
Yes.
Or supported by the teachers?
Well, no. I mean, most of the staff did not know that there was a supply within their group. And he wasn't known. I mean, nobody knew about this except a group of these students whom he supplied with free narcotics firstly, and then obviously they became hooked to it. And in the beginning, he didn't take any money from them.
Right.
Towards the end, that's when he started making a majority of his living from them. I mean, you don't.
Well,
These children are away from home.
Yeah.
You don't tell them.
I mean, very interesting story. Is that typical of the kind of underside of boarding schools that now, again, I know you talk specifically about Upper Canada College, but even in the most elite schools, would you get that kind of thing?
Absolutely. I mean, the stories I've heard about the drug problem at Upper Canada, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, because these kids have a lot of disposable cash, they're getting, you know, high-quality drugs. I heard stories of other high schools and kids in Toronto going to Upper Canada to get the best drugs. I mean, this is
wow.
This stuff has to be, you know,
I suppose
looked
there
at.
is. I mean, you just mentioned something that never struck me, but of course, they have huge amounts of dough, don't they? Like,
absolutely. There's a huge paradox here because it's the idea of being spoiled and indulged and at the same time abandoned or abused. I mean, there's a weird mixture of things that happens to these kids. And back to the sexual abuse thing, I think there's a double problem. If you're, say, the son of a cabinet minister or you have a family name to protect, are you going to come forward to the media or to a therapist or to anybody. You have a double whammy. I mean, you know, the kids at Maple Leaf Gardens, that's tough enough to come forward.
Right.
I mean, it's really very hard. But if you come from a privileged background.
Yeah, I mean, to coin another cliche, I can see that it's its own kind of conspiracy of silence, isn't it? There's an awful lot of reasons to keep quiet.
That's right, and it's a real problem. It really is, and it's endemic. It's particular to Upper Canada, particularly because of its iconic status and because of the number of famous Canadians that have gone there.
That's part of the conspiracy, I suppose.
That's right, and there were actually Upper Canada College old boys who have gone on to be headmasters at other private schools like Lakefield and TCS and St. John's Ravencourt, and they're all over the place. And these are, I was really impressed, because they were progressive because of their experiences at Upper Canada, what not to do.
James Young Jason Young is in Abbotsford. Jason, tell us about your experience.
I went to the Robert Land Military Academy under the auspices of Mr. Bowman. I showed up as a grade 10 dropout student, more or less, and went from being a D student to now I'm a third-year history political science major in university.
So, good story.
Good story and bad. Academically, I excelled. Emotionally, I was a head case.
Because of the boarding school experience?
Because of that particular experience.
Well, tell it without names and without, you know, but what kind of messed up emotionally are you talking about?
I left with the extreme confidence in my academic abilities, but zero self-confidence. I was basically under the impression for the majority of the year that I wasn't worth the breath that I breathed.
Real? Well, so what kinds of things were done? Was that just comments that were made?
Comments, calling down by faculty and staff members. Basically, there's a criteria that's set of achieving a certain status, and if you don't make it, then you're not really worth our time, and you're not going to amount to anything.
But you made it academically. Wasn't that status enough?
For me, yes, but there had to be some reinforcement of, well, you've got some problems, but you can accomplish things. If you don't make a certain status, oh well. There's a whole goal-driven orientation. I'm a third-year university student now. I'm a year from graduating. But when I left the RLA, I was a head case. I actually sat down with a psychologist just to get some of this crap out of my system.
Well, how can you succeed academically, and I think that's the great attractive thing, James, about boarding schools, is that private boarding schools, is that you're going to get this fabulous education. How can you get the fabulous education and be messed up, like Jason is talking about?
And pay $15,000 for the privilege. I mean, or 30 if you're boarding. I mean, that's another paradox. I mean, it's just a tiny percentile of the population can afford this. You know, I mean, it's remarkable. And again, I don't want to convey the impression that these are, you know, intrinsically abusive places. The problem is the attitudes, I think. And the attitudes are atavistic. I mean, and so it's a question of educating
So
the
can
elites.
you understand what James is talking about? What the caller was talking about? Can you understand him being able to achieve academically, but coming out messed up, still emotionally?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thousands of people in that condition, I think. I mean, I don't see that terribly contradictory. I mean, it's you can live in your head and, you know, be academically brilliant and cut off emotionally. You know, I mean, this happens.
James, thank you very much. Your book was published a number of years ago, and I didn't unfortunately get a chance to read it then, but I do want to say reading it now, it was just mesmerizing. It really kept me from first page to last, so I do highly recommend it to people as a good read, if nothing else. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Bye-bye.